today we have, in this section, we have Covid-Gothic, how the literature of terror and horror can help us understand the coronavirus pandemic, with Professor Nick Groom and William Hughes. The following section is going to be in the language of English, and I will do a brief introduction of the two professors. So Professor Nick Groom is Professor of Literature in English at the University of Macau. He has published widely in the academic and popular press and has written and edited several books on the Gothics, as well publishing on subjects including culture and the environment, national identities, and Shakespeare. His most recent book is 21st Century Tolkien, What Middle-earth Means to Us Today, published in 2022. And Professor William Hughes is Professor of Literature in English at the University of Macau. He has published 21 books and over 50 papers on his specialized fields, medical history and supernatural fictions, and has made numerous appearances on British and European television. And the following section, I will leave the mic to the two professors. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that very kind introduction. And it's lovely to see so many people here this afternoon. Now, we're going to run this really as a conversation. So we'll be talking to each other, perhaps disagreeing with each other as well. And we would like to invite questions from you, the audience, as well. I should think that probably the last third will be given over to questions. So if you do have things you'd like to talk to us about, please don't hesitate to join in that particular section. But I'm very pleased to be talking today. And of course, 2022 is the 300th anniversary of Daniel Defoe's A Journal of the Plague Year. And that's really why Ricardo Pinto invited us to talk this afternoon. So, the Journal of the Plague Year, what do we know about that? Well, it's a work that Daniel Defoe, as I say, published in 1722. It's ostensibly by somebody called H.F., which may be Defoe's uncle. It's possible Defoe was using notes or a diary or a memoir that his uncle had kept during the plague of 1665 in London. But then Defoe is such a slippery literary figure. Nothing's really certain or reliable. He might have just made up the whole thing or based it on other lost reports. But I'd just like to begin with a quotation which is on the PowerPoint. If we can bring that up. It's not completely necessary. You're using the light. It's okay. We don't need it. I can read it out. So, what are the comments in the journal? At one point, H.F. wonders whether the plague could be sent through, that's the previous one, through infected breath. And he says, I've heard that it was the opinion of others that the infection might be distinguished by the parties breathing upon a piece of glass. Okay? And where the breath condensing on the glass, there might be living creatures seen by a microscope of strange, monstrous and frightful shapes, such as dragons, snakes, serpents, and devils horrible to behold. Get the right slide. Yeah. There it is. So in other words, he's suggesting that in the breath of people, there are these monstrous, minute but monstrous creatures. Say, dragons, snakes, serpents, and devils, horrible to behold. So the plague is being supernaturalized by the people who are at threat from it. They're seeing it as, the only way they can imagine it is as a supernatural threat, something that is nightmarish, something that is fantastical, something that is threatening, poses a real existential threat. Typically, Defoe, the very next sentence he says, that he actually questions the truth of this because we had no microscopes at the time. So he undermines what he's just said by bringing science into a relationship with these monstrous beings that seem to be spreading the plague. Now, this was just before vampires hit the news in the, say, 1720s and particularly in the 1730s. But exactly 100 years later, so that's 200 years ago this year, there's a poem published called The Vampires of London. And this was subtitled A Tale of the Last Pestilence. So this too is referring back to the plague of 1665. And now it's not these dragons and serpents and devils that are to blame, it's vampires. And we learn that, again, it's spread through breath. And in fact, it's so contagious that just a single drop can infect and kill somebody. And so the vampire motif runs through this particular poem. And at the end, the vectors, those infected, are described as vampire sprites. So really what I'm trying to suggest to you is the level at which this pestilence, this plague, this pandemic is being imagined. And there are no other ways of imagining it except through the supernatural figures. But something that Professor Hughes might want to comment on is the more rational, scientific, statistical details that are also being used by Defoe in this particular work.
Absolutely. I'm going to come in, before I do that, I actually want to sort of pick up on something that Professor Groom's just come up with, and I think it's a very important point. This matter here, and what we had in that previous quotation about breathing. Breathing is one of the most remarkable things that we do, because we do it without thinking. We may occasionally think to breathe deep. We're instructed by a doctor, we breathe deeply to carry away panic or something similar. But breathing is the most natural thing possible. So when breathing becomes the most dangerous thing possible, it's a doubly perplexing moment. It's a moment of true uncanniness where we realize that the very thing that is possibly keeping us alive will be the very thing that could bring us to death. And you can't stop breathing. If you attempt to stop breathing, if you hold your breath, you sooner or later will get that tussive movement in the chest, which will bring you back to breathfulness, bring you back to the power of breathing itself. So I think to remember breathing, we need to also think about the context that Defoe is writing in. And he's writing in a sort of Protestant Christian consciousness in which breathing is also very much associated with the processes of creation and indeed the processes of death. We have that expression, to breathe one's last breath, which has to be said almost with a breathless horror. But we've also got the association, the initiation of life in the Bible with the breath of God being passed into Adam, being passed into the sort of the divine essence, as it were, fitting itself into the human body, the immortal entering the mortal, but not quite making it immortal. And I just find that's something that came out. We often think about blood now as the great sort of taboo. We dare not touch blood. We dare not mingle blood. We take all sorts of precautions in the age of AIDS to avoid physical contact with this, again, naturally flowing, naturally moving, naturally irresistible substance that is part of us for a while. And yet our ancestors possibly didn't see blood in quite the same way as they might have seen breath. So we've got an alternative view there. What Professor Groom was saying earlier, though, was about the notion of bills of mortality, and these were published across the period of the plague years itself. And the plague itself was in 1665 to... Excuse me a second. That's it. 1665, 1666. Every week or so, a publication appeared which was like the local death count. This only happened in the capital city. The plague affected other places in England, most notably Eyam in Derbyshire, but it was London that made the plague into a news event. This was the first great news event in which it was covered almost in a televisual sort of way, by broadsheets, by announcements in the streets, by calling. I'm just, in front of me, I've got one day's particular matter of the plague itself and what happened, how many people died. Abortions, 6. Aged, 54. Bedridden, 1. Apoplectic, 1. Then you get some interesting ones. Dropsy, 40. Drowned, 2. 1 at St Catherine's Tower, 1 at Lambeth. Fever, 353. All of a sudden we go into triple figures. Gangrene, 1. Gout, 1. Grief, 1. And then plague, 3,880. That sudden moment at which statistics turn, where one person suffering from gout or gangrene or some other complaint, where one person is a statistic so easily forgotten, so easily lost in a city of several 100,000 inhabitants, 3,880 is a massive number of people, a massive quantum. It's like a warfare situation. You surely know one of these people. You surely are now connected by relationship, possibly by living in the same house, the same street, the same quarter. That feeling of horror is there. Who is the demon? Who is the sprite? Who is the plague carrier? Because they are not marked on their forehead like a plague-ridden house is marked with a cross on the door. They are not necessarily shown to be spotted with it, because it could be under the cover of clothing. The only way to know for sure is to see them naked, and culturally that is not an acceptable practice, even sometimes for doctors. So the statistical matter, I think, here is that statistics become horror. Statistics become grave. Certain words attain a type of puissance, a type of power. If you say plague, people will back off. It's like coughing on a bus. We know this now. You know, you're on a bus and the person next to you cough, and you can watch people just gradually shrink back from them. Because, in a way, a cough is a word. That's like Charles Dance, isn't it? Ring a ring a roses. That kind of scenario there. The words are almost fatal.
Yeah. I think that what Professor Hughes has been saying about the statistics is very revealing, because, of course, it shows a much more rational way of trying to come to terms by categorizing, by cataloguing, by keeping records, and by having witnesses, effectively. And this is something that characterizes these attempts to deal with both contagion and the supernatural at this particular time, because it appeared certainly when reports of the spread of vampirism started appearing in the 1720s and 1730s. One of the things that leads to are the authorities investigating with military teams of surgeons and magistrates and notaries and so forth, exhuming corpses and then providing accounts back to, this is in the Eastern Europe, back to the Habsburg Empire in Vienna. And there are hundreds of these accounts. And some of them are published, but the whole point is that they are all witnessed. And so this appears to be genuine testimony. It appears to be verified. It appears to be authenticated. And this is one of the reasons why the vampire mania grips Europe, because it seems to be there's so much evidence, and yet nobody's actually met a vampire. But there's not just evidence from the witness, their testimonies and so forth. It's also a way of trying to explain these sudden outbreaks of serious and fatal illness. So vampirism becomes a way of accounting for the inexplicable spread of disease. And in fact, I think I've got a slide of some of the symptoms. perhaps not. Yes. So all of these symptoms are the symptoms that would actually suggest that you were suffering from vampirism. You've been bitten by a vampire. Well, if you read through it, not only does it make you feel quite poorly, because we've all suffered from things like nausea, headaches, and so forth, and anybody who's ever drunk too much will recognise these symptoms as well. But it just shows what a catch-all this could be. And it's also often very intangible symptoms. It's not the stuff that we're talking about with the earlier plague of having marks on the skin, for example. These are how you feel. And so it's very, in other words, they are almost invisible symptoms. And I'd just like to pick up on a couple of things that you were saying about the breath. I mean, one of those is that certainly, see, it was gone now, doesn't matter. Somebody called James Titler wrote a study of the plague and yellow fever. And he's noting how the plague kills suddenly and invisibly. So there's a sort of fascination with those sorts of effects. And it's this fear of the invisible, this fear of what you can't touch or see that really sort of characterises. I mean, that's another way that the supernatural comes in. It's the unknown. It's the stuff that you can't explain. And this went so far as to not only fear the breath of people, but there were earlier theories about whether the plague could be carried through words. So if you heard somebody speaking, like you're all listening to me now, are the words, because they're entering your ear, are they somehow going to carry the plague? There was another theory that it was actually sight. It was being seen by an infected person, and that this could cause you to become a victim of plague. So for that reason, doctors would blindfold their patients so they couldn't be looked at. So obviously this sort of engages with theories and the folklore of things like the evil eye, where somebody looks at you and that look can, like the look of the basilisk, for example, that can cause damage. But it just goes to show how people are trying to make sense of this, but they don't have the capacity beyond the supernatural and the invisible to do so. So really suggesting that it's breath and also not washing your hands, that was proposed as a serious possibility. That's on the same spectrum. It's in the same category as speaking words or seeing people as a way of spreading these things.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just looking at that piece from Zopf, also known as Zopfius in some versions of the translation. And I'm just thinking about how much it reminds me of the Victorian definition of hysteria, which is specifically a female complaint in the 19th century till late in the century when it becomes also transmissible to males, but is, in particular, a transmissible disorder because you see someone getting hysterical and you become hysterical yourself. I mean, there's a marvellous scene in James Hogg's Memoirs of a Justified Sinner where people start repeating the words that are said to them as they become more and more concerned about a sort of mysterious figure who is apparently dead but alive at the same time. And that kind of sort of repetitive hysteria, these symptoms here, the pulse is erratic and weak. On the throat and in the hypochondria, that is to say in the air of the belly, beneath the chest cartilage, livid or reddish spots are to be seen. The paroxysm exhibits itself in extreme night terrors associated with a loud cry, strong trembling, a spasmodic contraction of the muscles of the upper body, thorax. That's the globus hystericus, the rising womb, the rising ball that is associated with panic. This is actually feminizing patients. This is placing those who are sick into a subordinate and subjected position beneath a patriarchal medical establishment, and one that is not feared to utilize the supernatural to enforce and empower that. Go forward in time to Dracula. Who is the great magus of Dracula? Dr. or Professor Van Helsing. Male, medical, legal, all the other qualifications he has stack up. And he believes in superstition, or he believes that telling people about superstition will best achieve the ends of containing what is an epidemic of vampires at the same time?
So, I mean, we have been talking about historical plague. We started off talking about the Journal of the Plague Year. But the two of us have actually been thinking about the Gothicization of the pandemic for over 2 years now. And so we ran a conference, an online conference, and then published some of the papers in a journal under the title Corona-Gothic, the title of which was supplied by my colleague, Professor Gibson. Because these things are very much happening today as well. So when we had the first reports of the... Oh, I don't know who he is. When we have the first reports of the pandemic reported in the UK press, the Daily Mail actually wrote that... where is it? It's... shame we can't get the actual page up. It's going to come up. There we are. From bat to snake to humans, the coronavirus is a real-life sci-fi nightmare. Right, so a health reporter as opposed to our Gothic author. so just look at that. So bats and snakes, sort of for the West, those are characteristically sort of monstrous and threatening creatures. Bats obviously associated very much with vampires again. And then we have a real-life science fiction nightmare. We have both science fiction and the Gothic there. So this is how it's being imagined. So this isn't... We're not now just talking about the 18th century and the 19th century. We're saying this is how the Western press are actually trying to come to terms with the virus. And this hasn't gone away. Although what has gone away is the statistical reporting. So the sorts of figures you were quoting, there are websites that show the numbers of the dying in the West. It's very, very seldom reported in the news anymore. To all intents and purposes, it's post-COVID in the West, even though in the past week, nearly 600 people in the UK died, about twice that in the US, and I think 470 cases, COVID was listed on the death certificate. So it's still very much happening there. But in a sense, the rhetoric has run its course. And the thing that now is being perhaps Gothicized is the whole idea of a risk society, the whole idea of safety, but also, of course, politics. But having said that, this was in the New Yorker last year, Why the Vampire Myth Won't Die. And this is because anti-vaxxers, those who believe that vaccination is some sort of conspiracy, have in the US been arguing that vaccination turns those vaccinated into vampires. And this was a conspiracy theory that did gain some traction in the US. So again, the persistence of this language, this imagery of the supernatural, of the vampire, and the vampire is one of the most contemporary, I think, of sort of Gothic beings in the 21st century. It's not just the vampire myth won't die. It's the fact that the Gothicization, the use of those figures and that language to try to explain the pandemic is not going to go away either, for the time being.
I think the interesting thing about vampires, and this is vampires in modernity rather than those 18th century vampires we were looking at a little bit earlier, going to the time of, say, specifically to Bram Stoker and going forward into the contemporary, vampires have become associated not just with the sucking of blood, but with the use of networks, with the use of transport networks of communication, of items of communication, telegraphy, television. The vampire Lestat, for goodness sake, becomes a rock star. You can't get more media savvy than that. And I think that this is one of those things. Why vampires won't die is because they have now channeled themselves as a metaphor and as users into so many other potentially viral situations, that they are like computer viruses. They are part, if you like, of a sort of matrix version of the universe, where they slip into systems, they utilize mechanisms and so on and so forth. And I think this is one of the important reasons why the vampire myth won't die. We assume, as it were, that vampires or an act of vampirism is what sucks the money out of our bank accounts, or what sucks the vitality out of newspaper reporting, what drains ourselves. Even the doom-scrolling action with your thumb as you've got your phone in your hand and you continuously work your way through it. What is it doing? It's eating your time. It's eating your eyesight. It's eating the power of your body to actually live in a real rather than virtual world. In this sense, the vampire is a sci-fi beast. It is something to do with a modern world. And space vampires have been doing the rounds since the 1960s. We know that. It's what I find very interesting is that these plague networks, and this comes a lot in horror writings, plague networks are very much implicated in transport networks. They're very much implicated. I'm going back to people in the 1970s like Terry Nation and his novel Survivors, in which basically plague is spread from someone who gets on a plane in Hong Kong airport and gets off in Heathrow, whereupon everybody who's been on that plane disperses to other planes, spreading it to other international airports, so that within a week the entire world is infected. It is a global village like Eyam in Derbyshire, where when one person catches, everybody catches. Think about the internet. Think about incautiously sharing files. Think about incautiously not checking your emails. Think about not having a virus checker on your email. Even that word virus, it used to be a medical term. It's now a term in electronics. Like @ used to be a symbol in accounting, is now a symbol in computer science. This is language changing perception. And indeed, this is language transmitting situations. When you hit something with .exe on the end of it, you put yourself at risk. Just like when you open the door to a vampire and invite him in. That's what you're doing. Just be very careful out there.
Certainly, the idea of what you're saying about using computers is part of the challenge that the World Health Organization have identified is that we've had an actual vaccine now for 2 years, but you also have to cope with the culture of vaccination and the culture of the pandemic, and that's why the World Health Organization and certainly in Britain, the British Medical Council, whoops, the wrong one, we'll come up with that in a moment, I've been talking about dealing with misinformation, dealing with the spread of fake news, dealing with these alternative theories which may well be politically motivated. So it's what you call a wicked problem. Solving COVID isn't just about the vaccine. It's not just about social distancing. It's not just about wearing masks. You have to deal with the culture in which people are making sense of it and imagining it in order then to take that into account. So it needs solutions not just from the medical sciences, but also from the social sciences. And I'd also argue from the arts and humanities, because that's how we imagine things. And we need to be aware of that. And I think it's important to think about the ways in which you are talking about and articulating, expressing your fears and anxieties about the pandemic, because you may well find that you're doing so in these very supernaturalized, gothicized, and sort of rather fantastical ways, because there's no alternative. The thing is, we also had to check facts very carefully. A fact that I didn't check before I came, which I meant to, is I was told that coronavirus, being a virus, is so small that the entire matter of the virus globally would not even fill a Coke can. It's that small. It's unimaginably small. But I'd say I didn't fact check that. So
I think it's quite interesting you picked up on a Coke can there, because of course there is another viral object in its own right. The minute Coca-Cola hit Russia, it was deemed a sort of triumph for the West. We have penetrated the Iron Curtain, and there it is. Next goes in McDonald's. And, there's an element of truth in that. Viral is a very, very broad term. And I think that this point about sort of mass data overwhelming data and fake news, false trails is crucial. This is why the arts are so vitally important, that the ability to judge based upon rhetoric, based upon fact-checking, based upon actually observing how words make concepts, make situations, make truth. Because truth isn't absolute. Truth is what you can prove. How that rhetoric works is a crucial function of an arts education in any level. And I think, it's partly that. I mean, I think the other thing, my students who are present will recognise this probably quite frequently, World War Z, which I seem to be living in at the moment. I've never put this book down. For those of you who've never read the book but have watched the film, forget the film, just go and read the book. The film's rubbish. Film is nothing like the book. The book is much better. But a large part of this book details the power of misinformation, the power, as it were, of people who sell you a solution. If you take this drug, you will be fine. If you have this operation, you will stay alive. And these things contradict themselves. What it means is, if you take this drug, I will make money. If you have this operation, I'll make even more money. If you participate in my discourse, if you participate in my way of running the world or seeing the world, you will assist me to grow at your expense. Sounds like vampires again, doesn't it?
It certainly does. And why are vampires so persistent in the 21st century? Well, I mean, we've suggested one of the reasons is that they can give expression to this, not only viruses, but fears of medicine. And there have been other examples happening across Africa and Europe of suspected or claimed vampire outbreaks to do with fear of Western medicine. But that's partly because vampires are sort of fascinating in culture, because they have a biological logic. They physically exist. They physically exist as entities, not as sort of as thought experiments. I'm not going to suggest that there's a whole load of vampires on the back row, although we could check with a mirror possibly. No, they have a biological logic, so that they have to get nutrition in a way that's quite different from ghosts or zombies or demons, for example. So they appear to be part of our ecosystem. They appear to be part of our environmental landscape. But because they prey upon humans, they displace the human from the centre of things. They are a predator. And as I've said to some of my own students, they are both an endangered species and yet hunted to extinction at the same time. So they begin to throw up moral questions here. But I think it's their tangibility. And you certainly see this in a lot of vampire fiction. A great deal of attention to blood, to circulation, to forensic details, to bite, to the gums sort of pulling away from the teeth, for example. So despite their intangible qualities, in other words, their role as vectors of disease and the way that they are seen to have some powers over these invisible forces, they are, in a sense, Gothic or a fantasy, a fictional sense, very much located in our world in a way that many other fictional creatures aren't. And that's one of the reasons I think that they attract this particular attention. They sort of act as almost like lightning rods to attract this attention and to try to help us to make sense of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing about vampires is that they're so effective because people don't believe in them. And this is the point. This is why in contemporary vampire fiction, vampires can walk in and out of places because nobody believes in their existence. And this is like not believing in the existence of a pandemic or a plague. Oh, I won't be affected. I will walk into that room. Someone coughs or bleeds all over you. You are then infected. You are brought into the system itself. The point you made, though, about the endangered nature of the species is because the desire to actually remove the vector from the system, to normalise something. And in a way, of course, it's like sequestering the patient, taking the patient, the infected person, out of circulation, because they've become like the vampire. They look like one of us, but they're dangerously circulating in the body politic, like a sort of a virus in the blood itself. We think about cities and bodies being very like each other. They are circulatory mechanisms. And the economy of this, and I think it is an economy, a sanguine economy, as it were, is about depletion and repletion. When it becomes satisfied, it stops attacking. When, on the other hand, it's hungry, it continues to attack until it's satisfied. Now, whether or not we can say that about a sort of atomized thing like a plague is a very difficult thing, but a vampire very easily fits that mode of motion.
And also because, as you just said a moment ago, you can't recognise the vampire without, close scrutiny, in the same way that you can't recognise somebody who's suffering from COVID-19. So it's making the familiar, it's making perhaps your friends, your family, into the unfamiliar. And of course, that's uncanny. But it's also made everyday life very unfamiliar. So it's not just about whether somebody's got the virus or not. Daily routines have radically changed. The arrival of post and packages has been seen as a threat. What once was homely is now seen as strange and alien. Now, possibly this might make us more aware of the wonder of everyday life, because it shocks us out of those familiar, routine, conventional practices. But of course, it also displaces us. It alienates us from the world that we thought that we recognised and could cope with. And that sort of too is that sort of unseen and persistent threat. And this sort of keeps on happening, certainly in the West. With now Dracula's castle becoming a place for vaccination. So it's become a way of monetising the actual virus and attracting tourism. So this sort of is a sort of strange reflection on what we've actually been saying, is that it's, vampires have been literally embraced in Romania because of the boost to the tourist industry, but they've now added another level to that. By making it, by actually sort of capitalising on the pandemic, and there's something similar in the revival of what's called goth fashion, which is sort of very dark, often drawn from horror films or from Victorian Gothic novels. Is I was actually asked last year to comment on the revival of this, and I suggested that coming out of the pandemic may be likened to rising again, returning to life after a tomb-like incarceration. But this is still how it's being imagined, I think. So it's being Gothicized not only at the level of the fear of the unknown and the fear of coping with it, but also in terms of dark tourism, going to Dracula's castle, and also in the high street fashion industry.
I mean, I think this causes a slight sort of reconsideration of what a plague or an epidemic or contagion actually is. That maybe it's less about that microscopic thing you can't see and more about the disruption that it brings. If one person gets ill, we might feel sympathetic or sorry, but we don't really notice it. They disappear for a while from our world. They return, looking a bit paler perhaps, or a bit more frail, but they come back and, I had a terrible dose of flu, I was ill, I ate something bad, whatever. And yet, it's when it affects multiple people that I think plague becomes an institution, becomes institutionalized. It is because of its capacity to disrupt, its capacity to insert itself like a vampire's fangs or like a virus into the very fabric of interpersonal existence, into the way we move from place to place, into the way we eat and drink, into the way we sit close to or away from each other, whether we erect a barrier between us when we sit in a line, or however. Those things are what define an epidemic, a pandemic, or a plague. Not the contagion itself. It's the total effect, the total twisting of the everyday norm. In Britain, we had thrown at us that wonderful phrase, wasn't it? Well, welcome to the new normal. And I thought, no, let's hang on to the continuing abnormal, because this isn't normal for me and I don't like it. And that's what I'm getting at. The whole notion of the new normal was a rhetorical gesture to control people's reaction to restrictive circumstances. Oh, it's normal now, so forget what you did before. It's fine. No, it's not fine. And I think that makes a bit of a difference.
Should we take another sort of step back into history with the images that we've got here? We'll just skip forward to some of those. There we are.
Ah, yes. Right. This is an 1882 illustration from Bram Stoker's first fictional volume, a book of fairy stories for children called Under the Sunset. And it depicts plague as an invisible giant hovering over a city. And the interesting thing about this narrative is that only one person in the entire city can see the plague, a young girl called Zaya. And Zaya is innocent and pure of heart. She looks out of the window and she sees this monumental figure hovering over the city. It hasn't quite reached the city yet. It's far closer here than it actually is in the discussion she's making. And the figure is blind. In other words, the figure will affect anybody and everybody. It is not choosy. It hits the rich and the poor alike. It hits the old and the young alike. And I think what we find is then the girl runs out into the streets and she talks about, she said, beware, the giant, the giant. And those of you who've seen the poster which is advertised this event see another picture of a giant lying on the floor. That is a giant that occurs earlier in the book, a giant who is killed by a giant slayer, a young prince. But here, nobody believes her. They say, the child is mad. The child is mad. And they ignore it. There is no cure, of course. The only cure is to run. The only cure is to absent yourself from the presence of the dangerous substance or the dangerous plague, personified as this Gothicized figure, not just of a giant, because it's big, but almost of a ghost, almost of something translucent, transparent, human yet not human, a memory of something that people have lost or forgotten, a memory that has become so obscure that is not recognizable. Do you want to go?
Well, I've just been told of the time that we've got just 15 minutes left, so if there are any questions, but we've still got another few images and things to talk about, but if anybody has any pressing questions, please ask them now. I think if you stick your hand up, you can be given a microphone. Okay, yes, can we have a microphone for somebody at the back, please?
You have said before that in the Gothic period that the vampire is somewhat kind of like a metaphor for those horror things, for those the things that people will escape from and don't want to be avoided. But nowadays that I believe that vampire is somewhat become an image or a character that kind of related to romanticism. Like there is a very famous book series called, I remember, Twilight Saga, and something like that. And you have said before about the connection of vampire and medicine that it gives to COVID. In a socialist view, that the vampire is the big boss, the CEO of this medicine company. What do you think of this formula and as the alienation of vampire as a character and this connection with the capitalist system and the COVID? The medical company. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I'll start off on that point you made about vampires having changed in the 20th century. We can date this to Anne Rice, an interview with the vampire, when the vampire gets a voice. And I think this is connected with our whole revisionist stance in the world today, which is allowing, formerly subaltern peoples, colonialized peoples, disabled groups, repressed groups, to suddenly voice and insistently voice their presence. I think that's where that sort of image of the vampire as someone who is speaking their own life, speaking their own pity, speaking their own regret, speaking their own sort of feelings. Vampires suddenly have feelings. They're no longer implacable bloodsuckers like zombies are implacable flesh eaters. They are now suddenly sympathetic characters. Lestat makes us feel a bit warm and fuzzy around the edges, even if he is going to rip our throats out one of these days. But I think that's where that part of it comes from. And of course, it's also partly a denial. If a vampire is speaking to us as a friend or an associate, we wouldn't recognise that vampire as a plague substance or as a nasty person. No, we wouldn't. We'd let it by. We wouldn't chase it. We wouldn't persecute it. We wouldn't drag it into another space.
Yeah, well, I think it's a great question, so thank you. And you're certainly right that there are now sparkly vampires, and in part because of the influence of Twilight. But I'd assign the causes as something a little bit different. The vampire is very, very prevalent in cinema throughout the 1960s and 70s, but then it gets into rock music. And it becomes a figure to be admired and imitated and mimicked. And that's when you get goth fashion taking off with groups such as The Damned, whose lead singer is Dave Vanian, after Transylvanian, or a group such as Bauhaus. And so they're singing about vampires, they're dressing as vampires, and then suddenly it becomes, acceptable. It's certainly a form of rebellion. It's only rebellion through clothes. But in order to actually take on the persona of a vampire. And from that, it's going to be a fairly short step to making vampires erotic, objects of desire. And there's a film such as The Hunger, I think really do sort of play on that. In terms of Twilight itself, I think that you have about 20 years of this sort of tide growing. As you say, people finding these new communities. The first Twilight book comes in the aftermath of Facebook. And I think that it's very much to do with people. Now everybody can reinvent themselves online. And now they can actually start finding like-minded people groups, perhaps across the world that they've never known before. And so that sort of speed of self-reinvention accelerates. And then sort of vampires then move into this, and you get green vampires, you get vampires who live on blood substitutes, and so forth. But at the same time, you've still got the sort of shocking ones in works such as The Strain, I think.
It's also, as well as self-invention, it's replication and self-replication. There are certain images that people will imitate. And when you mentioned The Damned, I mean, or indeed Bauhaus, the imagery that is there on the stage when these bands are playing becomes what the fans wear when they go home. And you become, as it were, your hero. You're colonized by your hero. Then your younger siblings or your associates at school say, "Oh, I want to be that cool. I will be that cool. I will get the same thing too."
So I think it is led by popular culture. Yeah. I think it's an interesting example, because often those working in the humanities tend to dismiss popular culture. But I think that this is a case when it's it is affecting a series of generations' ideas.
We've got 5 minutes left. We'll probably get a couple more questions in if there's anybody else. Don't be shy. We don't bite.
Otherwise, I'll just, while you're thinking of a question, I'd just like to go back to another earlier example. This is from a writer called Sabine. That chap's come back again.
Was he back from the dead? That's what
It's certainly a spectral presence. But Sabine Baring-Gould, who was writing in 1904, so this is after Dracula, writes a short story called, A Dead Finger. And it's a story about another plague, another pestilence, another outbreak. And a vampire describes vampirism as the agent of social background. So folk once called us anarchists, social breakdown, nihilists, socialists, levellers. Now they call us the influenza. So that's the virus. The learned talk of microbes and bacilli and bacteria. Well, microbes, bacilli and bacteria be blowed. We are the influenza. We are the social failures, the generally discontented, coming up out of cheap and nasty graves in the form of physical disease. We are the influenza. So that's a vampire saying that. So this is very self-aware. The writers throughout the 19th and 20th century, I think, are very aware of this. And, for example, Bram Stoker's drawing on his mother's memories of cholera in much of his account of vampirism. So it's something that was explicit. Writers were aware of it, and they were making their readers aware of it, that this is a good way of trying to make sense of the inexplicable and the unexplained.
Any further questions? I'm very well aware that we've only got a couple of minutes left. Yeah?
Yeah, so, okay. Do I have a microphone? So I'm a teacher and I work with kids all the time, and I find it horrifying, like when they take off their masks in the school, because like, of course the government does not allow it and we may get in trouble. So, but the process of forcing them to put on their masks all the time, I also find it horrifying in a way, because in a way you're kind of like telling children that, you know, breathing is somewhat like dangerous, right, for you and your peers. And I was just thinking about that, and I would like to know like what you think and how you think like the pandemic may affect the next generations and, you know, children in the future. And also the picture that you showed us, like you said, like only that little girl can see the giant, right? So maybe there is some deeper meaning there too.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that, you know, the closing words of that story were innocence and devotion save the land. In other words, the giant turns away because one person believes in the giant's existence. One person believes that the giant is a real thing, not some sort of myth. The interesting thing you're putting about children and masks, I mean, it makes me think that breathing is now the new smoking. And that we will no longer be allowed to breathe near bus stops in Macau, which is slightly worrying. But there is an element of that in it. Incautious breathing can cause you damage. It's a strange thing. It's about boundaries. That the mask becomes the new body boundary. Don't get inside my personal space. My mask is my guardian. And that's changed the way we look at our bodies. Our bodies are no longer the boundary. Not even our clothing is the boundary. It's the orifices of the body that need to be protected. And protected by a substance rather than a drug. Protected by a commercial product. Because these things are manufactured and made and sold. You know, even if you get them free, they're still, someone pays for them.
Yeah, the mask has become as prosthetic that we can't live without. So it becomes an absolutely necessary extra. I mean, I wear contact lenses, and I couldn't function without them. So it makes us more aware of how we are relying on these non-biological, non-human, as you say, manufactured commodities. And I think that potentially threatens one's integrity.
There's also the point that they've become, in certain places, a sort of fashion accessory. I mean, in this room, I noticed most masks are sort of plain, occasional, rather nice fetching green one that you're wearing. But, you know, in Britain, when the mask wearing was at its height, people were walking around with national flags on or all sort of other matters too. And I think that's part of the sort of domestication of the situation. I've just received a message from the back to say that we need to now wrap up because obviously time is incredibly tight. So at this point, I will hand over back to the management of this wonderful event. And thank you all very much on behalf of Professor Groom and myself.
Thanks very much.
For your
Thank
attention.
you.
Thank you so much, Professor Nick Groom and Bill Hughes. Don't go away. We will have another session right away in about 5 or 10 minutes. It will be 1922 and the reinvention of literature. And this is going to be directed by Glenn Timmermans and also with Professor Matthew Gibson. So stay with us and thank you for your presence and thank you all for your contribution.